Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Race, Protests, and Journalism Ethics, a special program hosted today by the Society of Professional Journalists. I'm Patty Newberry. I'm the current president of SPJ, and I'm happy to be joined by the following folks in today's conversation. First, we have Fred Brown. Fred is author of Media Ethics, a Guide for Professional Conduct. He is a retired Denver Post reporter and editor and a former national president of SPJ. We also have Brittany Noble. Brittany is a 10-year veteran of television journalism who covered the Ferguson story in Missouri and most recently worked as an anchor for WJTV in Jackson, Mississippi. She is currently based in St. Louis. We also have Terrence Shepard. Terrence is news director at WLRN, an NPR station in South Florida, and he is the current chairman of RTDNA. Billy Calzada is a veteran photojournalist who has spent the last 20 years at the San Antonio Express News, covering a diverse community, the US-Mexican border, Latin America, sports, and anything else his editors ask him to do. And finally, we have Lynn Walsh. Lynn is chair of the SPJ Ethics Committee. She is assistant director of the Trusting News Project, and she also is a former national president of SPJ, currently based in San Diego. So let me start by setting the stage on our topic of the day. As all of you know clearly, on May 25th, George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis after police officer Derek Chauvin knelt on his neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. In the days that followed, protesters took to the streets of Minneapolis and then across the country and across the globe to protest police misconduct and systemic racism in policing and many other facets of American life. Over those weeks, journalists covering that story have also had the occasion to look inward in their own newsrooms, at their own practices, to consider the diversity of their staffs and the practices that guide their storytelling. That became necessary because of events both inside and outside newsrooms. As you likely know, across the country, more than 400 journalists have been attacked or threatened in some way directly as they have covered the protests. We know that staffers at places like the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Los Angeles Times have revealed their concerns about race issues inside their newsrooms. We know that leaders of some news organizations, including those at the Philadelphia Inquirer, Bon Appetit, and Refinery 29, have resigned under pressure because of their handling of race issues inside their newsrooms. So we convene today at a time when persons of color make up about 22% of newsrooms, and management positions go to about 19% of persons of color. So we'll get to it with our guests, and an invitation for you to be adding your questions or comments to the chat field. And then as we are able, we'll get to those and work those questions into the conversation. So for our guests, I'm going to ask you each to start by just commenting on the moment, essentially, addressing the moment, and two questions generally. What do you think journalism is doing well in this moment in covering protests? Doing well. And then also related, what has been deficient in the coverage of the protest story across the country? Who would like to start?
Well, I'll go ahead and start. I wouldn't like to start, but I'll go first.
Thank you.
It is important to be there. Showing up is so important during these times. To be there and acknowledge the grievances of people who are protesting, the pain that communities are experiencing, to invest for news organizations to invest a reporter time, photographers and producers to cover the story, to me says a lot. Because there might have been a time when it would not have happened. It might have been dismissed and relegated to a side note of our first draft of history. And the coverage is a major advancement, driven mostly by social media. And the fact that the ability to broadcast the ability to share one's views is widely available now. So news organizations have been forced to match what's already out there. So I think it's good. It's great that we're here. It's a great attempt at this first draft of history. I think one problem, though, is if you have kind of an old school mentality where the one news director or executive editor calls all the shots, that would limit your worldview to that person's preconceived notion about what the story should be. But now, I think reporters do actually go out and report. They give voice to people who have these issues. And so I think I'm going to give us good grades for being there and for responding to communities.
So being there is a plus, showing up, continuing, elevating the voices. Other folks, good or bad in terms of the coverage that you've been consuming?
Yeah, Terrence must have been like reading my mind. Same thing. I thought we're showing up, we are there. And I think not only, the reporters, the photographers in the field, I just think have done a tremendous job from everything that I've seen when they are kind of faced with some of these hard decisions. Maybe it's from protesters or even police. I think they have acted professional. And, they're putting themselves at risk. Not only is this kind of a dangerous situation, you also have COVID going on. I think the fact that we are there, I think we are showing up and we are showing people history. We're showing people what's happening and we're showing them the reality of kind of the situation. So I agree. I think that's kind of the best thing that we are doing. Some things that I think I've seen that we can improve on. I wish that us as journalists and, we would be okay saying we don't know sometimes. Like sometimes there's this need to fill the void, specifically on kind of breaking news coverage on television, kind of the anchor commentary. And I wish sometimes it would just be okay to say, we don't know what's going on. We're still trying to figure out. We're not sure what the next move is or what's happening. I also wish there was sometimes some more context added. So while you see people marching and protesting, I think there's more to that though. Can we tell solution-based stories more? I'd love to see some of our communities do more of that to what are the possible solutions to the grievances and the issues people are talking about.
Well, I made a note to come back to that term solution-based. Let's go to Brittany. Brittany, what are you seeing in the St. Louis market?
I think we're all in the same area and thinking that social media has been a major player in this game. And what I like to see, somebody that is no longer on TV. Remember, I was in Jackson, Mississippi when I filed an EEOC complaint about the way that I was treated as a young Black mother. At the time, we weren't wearing our natural hair. My reporters could. Myself as an anchor, I was not allowed. Okay, the handbook said that we were not allowed to have shaggy hair on TV. And so when I see that news directors and TV stations are embracing our Black reporters and allowing them to be their authentic self, allowing them to say things like Black journalists matter on social media without getting any, critique in the newsroom, I think that's a big deal. I think we're still struggling with diversity in the newsroom. When I was reporting in St. Louis with the death of Mike Brown, there were no managers of color in the entire city. And when I talk to my reporter friends here in St. Louis, they're saying that, news directors are still hiring 5 and 6 white people, recently, and we're still not getting that diversity that we need. Because remember, when I'm in the field, I can be gathering so much information for you, but you have to want to take it. You have to say, you're the one that's approving it and saying, this is what we're going to share and what we're not going to share on TV. So I think that if we have more perspectives in the newsroom, then we'll allow for our communities to be better represented when we're sharing news.
Okay, and we'll revisit some of those points as we move along as well. Fred, what are you seeing in Denver in terms of coverage there? And I don't know really the level of public protest there.
There's been quite a bit of protest, and in fact, some journalists have even been targeted by the police as well as by the protesters in some cases. I think generally, though, the benefit of having someone there covering with reporting and with images is that it gives a more fact-based perspective on what's happening, because when you have a trained journalist doing this, as opposed to someone who's recording on an iPhone, they are going to pay more attention to the nuances, the subtleties that perhaps someone who has taken side is not going to display. I think if there's a shortcoming, it's that we tend to get distracted by the shiny things, the flames, the damage that's done, instead of paying enough attention to the causes rather than the sometimes unfortunate results of these protests.
Very good. Those are some big themes as well. Billy, are you out on the streets in San Antonio? Has this been a big story there, and what are you seeing, good and bad?
This has been a major story, quite obviously. And I think what the good in terms of what we've been doing as journalists is that our newspaper has just sent out these solid, experienced journalists to go protest and tell fair, honest stories, make fair, honest pictures. We take it very seriously, and you can't help but to be very thoughtful in the way you approach these things when you're out there in the field. We've had major protests. We've had a couple of people that got hurt here and there. We've had a couple of journalists that got hurt, a couple of journalists that got hurt by police as well, rubber bullets and so forth. But I think by far and large, my way of thinking about this when I'm out there is like, I'm really trying to tell a fair story. And I'm trying to be honest with people. And I give people a lot of credit. When I tell them that I'm with the San Antonio Express News, and my name is Billy, I'm making pictures. I believe that they know where the pictures are going to be ending up. I believe they know that because I'm a rather outgoing person when I have the camera with me. And I converse with people. I don't just go up and make pictures. I converse. I'm among people. And I make my intentions known, and I ask for thoughts. And on occasion, I've had a couple of people that were like, "Oh, I don't want to be in the paper," and I'm thinking, well, I'm not going to put you in the paper. I'll even tell them that, unless, of course, God forbid, unless something really crazy happens, and But there's pictures to be had virtually in any direction where you turn. But of course, you've got to vet in your own mind what you're doing. You got to think about what you're doing and be sure you're making fair pictures, honest pictures. You're treating people properly, and even fellow journalists from other outlets. It's like we're looking out for each other. We're just doing the best we can. And honestly, I think that in this situation, the best we can is really quite good, at least in our market.
That's great. I want to segue over to the SPJ Code of Ethics. It's probably the most cited code of ethics for journalists across the country. SPJ takes a lot of pride in promoting it and sharing it with others. It has 4 precepts. The first is seek truth and report it. Number 2 is minimize harm. 3 is act independently. And 4th is be accountable and transparent. I'd like to hone in on 2 of those questions. And the first is the question of independent. So I think this crosses over into a couple comments that I've heard. And I'm going to go to Brittany first, right? So you mentioned that we're seeing some journalists take to Twitter or other social media and supporting the Black Lives Matter mission, statement, language, even sometimes Black journalists matter being a phrase that's catching some steam. So how does that square with independence in journalism in your mind?
In 2014, Michael Brown died. In 2015, the National Association of Black Journalists honored me with the Emerging Journalist Award of the Year. And it was then that a small group of my closest friends got together to honor me, and we cried. In that small room, my friends, we cried. And that is when I first remember us using the term Black Journalists Matter. And it took us years for our organization to even support us saying Black Journalists Matter. And so it's hard, at least it was very hard for me in 2014. I mean, I have a master's in journalism. I had worked in like 4 different markets by that time. I was the weekend reporter working in my hometown, and I just want to prove myself as a journalist. That's the reason why I called myself into work. That's the reason why I was willing to work on a Saturday afternoon. That's the reason why I was trying to help my producers out. And it was hard for me. It became hard eventually as the story progressed to stand in front of signs that say Black Lives Matter, but to pretend that my own life doesn't matter. And as a journalist, sometimes we can't take our biases out. I'm Black. I can't hide the fact that I'm Black. And I can't pretend that the things that they're saying, I don't feel that way myself. I've actually been one of those people to cross the lines. I hugged my photographers. I think it was like 1 week ago, they had a protest in downtown St. Louis. When I got out there, I saw my old photographer and I gave him a big hug. I grabbed a sign and I got in line because Black lives do matter. And so trying to figure out where the line is something that we're going to have to figure out and navigate together. But we can't pretend like our own biases don't matter. I can't go out there and pretend like I'm a Black person. I can't go out there and pretend like I'm not terrified that my brothers may get shot and killed by police and that I'm a daughter of police officers. That's something else that I couldn't share with our viewers. So I think that biases nowadays, it matters.
Mm-hmm. So this is very much a live conversation. I don't know if all of you saw the column that Wesley Lowery wrote that appeared in the New York Times. It talked about this idea of objectivity, and if you are a Black journalist, can you be objective? Can you have license to share your personal views even in the midst of covering these protests? So let me take it to Terrence for an opinion on that, this idea of independence and sharing your point of view on the issue that you're covering.
So I don't know if you're dipping your toes into the social media question about sharing my views.
Essentially, right. Mostly we're talking about Twitter traffic, I think.
Right.
Primarily.
Obviously, a reporter has to stick to the facts, stick to fairness, stick to accuracy. So when you use the word independent, does that mean that one does not have a preconceived notion when covering a story? Are you going out there to cover Black Lives Matter protests thinking, I'm going to report on people that think they're better than everyone else, Black lives are superior, people that want more government handouts? Or are you as a reporter going to cover events with as close to a blank slate as possible and see what happens? See what happens when you open your microphone up and ask people to tell you why you're there. I'm a Black man, as I said. I identify as being a Black man for decades. Because of that experience, I have a certain way of maybe relating to protesters that I cannot put aside. This idea that Black reporters shouldn't cover Black Lives Matter protests is ludicrous. Let me ask you, someone who is at risk of catching COVID-19, you're at risk of getting this disease, so does that mean you can't cover the disease?
Does your station have a policy on use of social media?
We do have a social media policy. When people violate the policy, we pull them aside, chat with them, tell them why it's wrong, why it could have been handled differently. Yeah, I think every news organization should have a social media policy. There should be different gradations of penalties. Sometimes a social media post may warrant firing. Sometimes it may warrant suspension. But sometimes a person just needs to be counseled and said, hey, this is not the way we'd like you to represent the station. Do better in the future. Because right now, I'm covering a virus. Got all hands on deck. I can't afford to take anyone off any big story. If someone out there feels like your reporter is misbehaving on social media, please have them come see me. We might have a place for you, because we are as journalists, we're facing crises like we have not faced in quite some time. And so yeah, we have social media policies. They need to be adhered to. If someone violates them, you need to talk to them.
I'm going to go to Billy and then Lynn and Fred. So Billy, in your news organization, do you get direction from your editors and managers regarding social media use? And how do you, as an individual photojournalist, position yourself in this moment? i.e., do you feel free to share your point of view on the protests or the action of protesters?
Well, I Twitter and Facebook virtually every photo I make for the newspaper. Uh, I put the information out there, the images out there, and I pretty much mirror the caption that I wrote for these pictures. I put that out there on Twitter and Facebook. And some people might think the information is dry, but I don't put in my personal feelings about this. I put it out there because I really believe that the viewer, the people will see and make their own decision about what this picture is about and what they should feel or think about it. My position is not to make someone think or feel something. My position is to be the witness, share the photos, and let the people decide on how they feel about what I'm showing them. I try to show the truth and only the truth. My newspaper, I believe they support my actions on social media. But of course, I am very, very careful not to interject too much my own feeling into what I do. But I do believe I have a fairly strong, maybe emotional Twitter feed because of the pictures that I'm putting out. But again, pictures having to do with the BLM protests, with the COVID, and so many other immigration issues, crime, so forth. It's very important to put it out. I put it out also in an attempt to maybe drive a few readers to my newspaper, of course. I can't hide that. But I take what I do seriously. I take my neutrality as seriously as I possibly can. I have opinions. I have thoughts. I'm only human, but I really try to keep those in check when I put it out there. I'm a Latino man. I've been profiled. I've been singled out at times, and I know what that's like, and it feels like hell. It does, but nevertheless, I got to stand by the ethics that I hold dear as a journalist.
You did mention, though, that you hope your viewers, people who come to your Twitter feed or your Facebook page, will see the emotion in your work. So what emotion are you trying to convey in general with your work?
Well, generally, when a photojournalist is making pictures, he or she is looking for a moment that defines what is going on. If someone is angry, I want my picture to convey that. If someone is in grief, I want my picture to convey that. And I try to make pictures that are in the moment, and that's what I share. I try not to be too, for example, if we have a 1,000 person protest, peaceful, and we have one person that breaks out and decides to do some damage somewhere, break a window or something, and I'm there and I make the photograph, I'm going to think really, really hard about turning in that one photo because it's not representative of what happened at that particular situation.
Good point. Lynn, wearing your hat both as the chair of the ethics committee and in your role with the Trusting News Project, talk about this concept of independence and whether a journalist who chooses to share an opinion on the protests can truly be independent.
Yeah, so I think it is, as people have said, kind of this fine line. But I think the experiences that we all have as different people who grew up differently, that are different races, grew up in different situations, family situations, I think that diversity can make us better reporters and make our newsrooms better. And I think at the end of the day, I think we shouldn't be afraid to share and or talk about those personal experiences if we have them. I saw two anchors have an incredible conversation live on television. I believe it was in Washington State. I think it was Seattle. One of the anchors was white, one of the anchors was black, and they talked about their biracial friendship and how they both have learned a lot from it. And they talked about this live on air. It was a very open conversation. And when I was listening to them, I didn't think, oh my gosh, I think they both are so biased now, because they opened up and they shared these personal beliefs. So I think this sharing these personal things, I think, can be done in a way that doesn't make you unable to fairly cover a story. Now, if you are sitting here, like sharing an opinion or kind of encouraging the defunding of police, well, that may be a different kind of issue, right? Then, yes, if I'm your news manager, I may not be able to have you cover a city council meeting where they're talking about that because of what was said. And I think if you're willing to kind of, talk about those things that could impact what you're covering beyond personal experience, that could impact exactly those people that you're covering, then you may not get those opportunities to cover some of those things. And I think also something that I tell a lot of young journalists is really sit down and think about what you're willing to share on social media. For some people, it's a lot more than others. I know for me specifically, I have no problem speaking very openly about my beliefs in open government and government transparency. And I have no problem kind of being very forthright about that. And that's an opinion I share. Other opinions about politics, I'm not going to openly share. So I think, what are you willing to share? Know that there might be consequences in your ability to cover certain topics moving forward, and that certain members of your community may not be able to think that you are non-biased, even though I think you can cover things, even though you share opinions. The last thing I do think is that if you have an opinion or you're covering something that you have a connection to, the key is to always be transparent about it and kind of explain that and be willing to have a conversation with your community about it.
Right, and that can sometimes shape the story. If the conversation is, this is a journalist sharing his or her journey, then perhaps that becomes the story, but as you say, might cut off other opportunities for assignments. You might find yourself in this lane in the newsroom versus that lane. So Fred, you're the author of the SPJ textbook on journalism, and you teach journalism ethics. Where do you stand on this question of independence?
Well, over my long and checkered career, I have been an opinion writer as well as a reporter. And that, of course, gave me an outlet to express myself. But I didn't express myself personally so much as I did in, for instance, writing an editorial about a candidate that the newspaper wants to endorse. That is a part of an editorialist job that a reporter, actually it creates problems for reporters, because then people assume that the newspaper is not going to give fair coverage to the other side. I believe that today, social media gives a person who has a job as a reporter an opportunity to reveal a little bit more of her or his personality. And perhaps without getting too involved in politics, a little bit more about that person's reasoning processes and what shapes that person. Disclosure of unavoidable conflicts, I think, is a very important part of something that journalists should be given an opportunity to do. For instance, my wife was the marketing director for the state lottery, and I was covering state government. So I never, that's when I was a reporter I was a reporter on both sides of my editorial page stint. So I never wrote about the state lottery. I knew what was going on there, and I would, assign that to somebody else, which I was in a position to assign people to cover state government stories. And when I wrote an occasional column, even as a reporter, if I ever had to write anything at all about the lottery, I would have made that a part of that coverage. But we had a debate when we were writing the Code of Ethics in 2013, a copy of which I have posted prominently on my wall here, signed, by the way, by everybody who was on that committee. Anyway, we had a debate over whether it was important to stress independence or whether it was more important to stress disclosure, transparency about conflicts of interest. And we kind of came down on both sides of that issue, that it's a good idea to avoid conflicts of interest where possible, but if you can't avoid them, disclose them.
Very good. I want to move to this, the concept of avoiding harm, right? Journalists should minimize harm. And the question in play at the moment has to do largely with images. We're seeing a lot of chatter about subjects involved in protests who do not want to be photographed or are aggrieved after they're photographed and they see their images, either digital or video images, on in the San Antonio newspaper, in the San Diego, right? So I'm going to go to Billy first, because I assume that you actually referenced this already, that you might have a conversation with somebody who says, I don't want to be in your newspaper, I don't want to be on your website. So what's your thought on that? Should you give subjects the license to decline to be photographed?
Hi, Sean. This is dating. Yes, I believe so. I'm not asking for permission, but I do think that if there's no prevailing reason, bye, son. If there's no prevailing reason why I should put a certain person in the newspaper, a person who's a protester, I will honor whatever that person asks of me, unless there's a very, very good reason why I should do it anyway. I try to be an honorable man, an honorable human being when I'm not doing my job. I cannot separate that from who I am, but it's important and to go in there. I get in with the people. I speak with them, as I mentioned earlier, and they know what I am and they know what I'm doing there. I'm by nature, I'm a very friendly person, and I'm also a very gentle person. I've been criticized in the past by some people who say, you're really too nice to be a photojournalist. Well, I will tell you, I've missed pictures before because I was like, I can't do that. A grieving widow once at a news scene. It was an amazing photograph, and I just said, I can't do this, while I saw other photographers doing it. I can only speak for myself, and if I'm out there to cover a protest, to make good pictures. In fact, I've been thanked during this past month or so, much more often than I've been told, please don't make my picture. I've actually had people come up to me and say, who are you? San Antonio Express News. Thank you for being here. I hear that much more often than don't take my picture. I've only heard don't take my picture maybe once, maybe twice during the whole month. And I've had thank yous maybe half a dozen or more times. And I stand by that. I treasure those words when they come toward me. I embrace them, and I do tell people I'm doing my job, man. You're out here doing something that I think it takes a certain amount of courage to be out there as a protester, because it may or may not be safe. And it also takes a certain amount of courage to be a journalist out there, because it may or may not be safe.
Brittany, let me ask you to address that. When you were covering the Michael Brown protests in Ferguson, with a photographer, I assume, did you have people saying, don't take my picture, I don't want my face out there? And if so, how did you handle that?
No, I didn't have that problem. And I wonder how many people really are calling the newsroom saying, please don't show my face, because you know, and being out there more recently, I see that people are actually fighting for their lives. And for you to actually come outside and make your own sign and come out here with random people, because I mean, because you're fighting for you're sharing your voice, right? Usually I don't think people want to cover that up. I think you want to be seen. If you're going out there, you want to be seen. You want to have conversation. And actually my experience covering Mike Brown is that strategically, a lot of us Black photographers and reporters were placed away from the scene so that we couldn't get those conversations and we couldn't, you know, find out what was really happening, you know, at the nucleus. You know, we were far away. Sometimes my schedule was changed so that I would even be covering stuff like that. So I think that this is a deep conversation, and let's just like take a breath and let's just be glad that we're having it, you know, because I think that I mean, there's 79 people on here, and I see all of these, you know, comments on the chat, and people really want to, we're opening ourselves up to new ideas, and I think that's great. So I just encourage everybody to take a deep breath, because this is a hard conversation, at least for me to have.
Any other, the other folks here, you want to add anything on this question of, I don't know, Lynn, are you getting questions to the Ethics Committee about news organizations being asked to remove images?
Yeah, so at SPJ, we have an ethics hotline, and we hear from probably it's probably 50-50. We hear from members of the public and or either working journalists or student journalists. And we do get questions about this. I would say we recently, in the last year, have seen more than we did the year prior. I think maybe there was one the year prior, and now I've had 6, 7, or 8 of them just in the last couple months. And my thought is, you know, we have a role as journalists to capture what is happening. So I don't think the question is not to take the photographs, right? I think the question is we should be recording what's happening. We should be showing people what is happening. The question though is, how are we doing that? And I love, Billy, which you said, you didn't actually say like permission, but you do tell them who you are. You say, you know, this is what I'm doing. And I, you know, love that if someone came up to you and said, you know, I don't really want this to be in the paper. And if there are other photos that are just as powerful, why can't we honor that, right? And I'm not saying that's always going to be possible, but I do think there are things that we can do to maybe mitigate harm. And I think, one, yes, so glad we're having this conversation. 2, if we are thinking about this conversation while we are out taking those photos or filming video, I think it's going to improve our journalism. And I think the third part that I'd love to see us do more of is just have more conversations with the public about what our role is in these situations. Because I also don't believe that maybe everyone that's out there understands that they're in a public place and that their right to privacy really is non-existent. Now, that doesn't mean that we ignore that and take advantage of that. But I think having that conversation might kind of help this and build that relationship between the protesters and the journalists that are out there.
You know, Patty, there was a case at Northwestern University recently where the Daily Northwestern published pictures of a protest of a speech of Jeff Sessions, who'd been invited by the Young Republicans. And then a number of students complained to the newspaper that having their pictures published put them in a dangerous position. So the newspaper apologized. And a lot of Medill, Northwestern alumni complained about that, particularly the old farts. Being an old fart graduate of Medill, I did not complain, but I did put it in the ethics book. Should the newspaper have apologized? Probably not, because the protesters were in a public place, but I think it tried to explain itself. And I think it was a learning experience all around that when you are covering a news event in a public place, it is pretty much fair game. But I like Billy's approach. If somebody says at the time, please don't use my picture, I would honor that request.
Terrence, do your reporters come back from the field and tell you about conversations they have with with protesters, with police officers, and are you encouraging them to try to explain their motivations and their processes?
The protesters explaining why they're there?
No, do your journalists engage in conversation with protesters to kind of explain, hey, this is why I'm asking you these pictures. This is why I need to get your name. This is why I'm putting the microphone in your face. I need to get your voice because I work in radio, etc. Just explaining the method, the process.
That's kind of a given. People protesting on Biscayne Boulevard in Miami, they don't have an expectation of privacy. One thing I will say about images, though, this past week in my hometown in Louisville, there was a shooting at a protest. And I want to congratulate the news outlets that said, caution, graphic images ahead. I saw it. It was graphic. It was disturbing. I couldn't sleep. But I appreciated them issuing that warning. If you're capturing this poignant moment that Billy mentioned, of course, you're going to want to make sure they're okay with you publishing their photo because you can do harm. Just double check that they are aware of what we do. But no, we have not had that issue thus far.
I want to go to a broader question about diversity in newsrooms. The numbers are not great, right? And this is a conversation that's been going on for decades. So first, probably obvious, but why does it matter that we have diverse newsrooms? And secondly, why can't we improve those numbers? Who has some thoughts on that?
Well, diversity matters because having a diverse newsroom means your reporting is more accurate, it's more concise, it's more illuminating if you have people from different backgrounds in your newsroom. My view is probably not unique in that the reason is because we've had a certain demographic running newsrooms who hire people who they feel comfortable with, who look like them, or who graduated from Ivy League or some other school. And so when you get into that twisted thought process that your worldview is the only one that matters, you hire people who look like you, who went to the same college as you, who think like you, then you have a less credible news organization. Then you have people not trusting the news media because they're all the same. They come up with the same story. They have preconceived notions for every story. And so why should I go to them to find out what really happened?
Other folks, why does it matter and why haven't we made much improvement?
Patty,
I
I think,
think-
oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think, everything Terrence said is absolutely correct and I agree with. And I think, what I think sometimes we don't think about is it impacts so much. The lack of diversity impacts so much. It's not just the way the stories are told. It's what stories are even chosen to be told. It's the angles that are pursued. It's the people that are involved in who you ask questions to, who you go to for your sources, right? Or who become the legal go-to person after a Supreme Court ruling for your TV station or whoever it may be, right? That's impacting all of these things. And it goes beyond race, where people are from around the country, their political views, their leanings, their experiences, rich, poor, whether they went to school. I mean, it's all of these things. And when we don't have them, we don't reflect the communities we serve. And then the communities basically just don't get as much news coverage. One reason, the question to why we don't have, the diversity, I think something that I think about specifically in broadcast anyways is, if you want to make more money or get a better job, you have to move to a bigger market or become an anchor or become a manager. And I wish we could kind of fix that somehow to reward reporters that have been in a market for a long time or that commit to a community for a long time. And again, I'm speaking more from TV broadcasts because that's my experience, but I think that does impact hiring greatly because people come and go from smaller communities so quickly.
Brittany, in your experience, you faced a news management that had certain expectations about how you wore your hair. What can be done to counter that kind of policy and to bring more persons of color into television newsrooms, newspaper newsrooms? What are some solutions?
I think some solutions, what can be done, having conversations just like this. And we're trying to figure out what's next. We all have to take a step forward to figure out what's next. When we talk about diversity in the newsroom and my looks, it was hard because I was what I found out was I'm covering officer-involved shootings in St. Louis, right? So I'm going down to Mississippi. We really are not dealing with officer-involved shootings. We have a predominantly Black police department in Jackson, but lynchings is an issue. And so here I am trying to get us to cover certain stories and showing them what is a story and doing all my research, to prove, hey, look, I should investigate this. And I kept getting knocked down. And so for me, my hair was almost like, oh, what are we doing here? It wasn't until the 1970s that we had our first Black news anchor. And most of the newsrooms were created in the 50s and 60s during the Civil Rights Movement. And they weren't trying to share the, quote, Black Lives Matter movement at the time. Sometimes they were taking it off of TV. So I think having conversations like this, it was very hard having conversations with my news director. Why don't your curls lay flat? And Mississippi viewers need a beauty queen. And, asking me we were having very, very difficult questions. But the reality is that our communities need to see a TV newsroom, or they need to see news that represents them. They need information too, so they can make choices as voters. That should be, our mission. And I couldn't believe that while we had news to share in Mississippi, we were spending the time talking about my hair. And when we actually brought in the corporation to say, hey, look, can you look into this? Because I wrote the complaint. Even the HR with the corporation, they couldn't. They were just looking at me like, you're a beauty queen, and they're talking to me about being a beauty queen. So I think we just gotta, kind of pull. I don't know, we just need to have these real unfiltered conversations. I think that's what really can be done.
Right, and clearly you've had that conversation and opened up that particular issue, which is really, it's some amount of progress that you brought that to the forefront in your market.
Yes, but with that being said, I was denied the ability now to report, now we got COVID going on, and we really do have what I consider to be a civil rights movement going on, and I can't report. So maybe because I did share my voice, that was when we talked about earlier, you just won't get those assignments. I literally don't get those assignments anymore. And it's hard.
Brittany is available. Brittany is available, folks.
If you didn't know.
Terrence, I want to ask you, in your newsroom, what are you doing to address diversity? Do you have any particular goals or aspirations? How, are your folks talking about this? Do you have a plan of action to address your numbers?
In terms of hiring,
promotion, assignments, whatever the case might be.
So it's kind of a long story. I worked for the Miami Herald when they started this partnership with my station, and they always looked like the community. They always had diverse reporters, producers, anchors. And so I looked over and admired what I saw. And so when I became news director in 2013, the general manager said, Terrence, I want you to hire the very best person available for the job. And so we always keep that in mind. People who want to judge on our numbers, go to WLRN.org and check out the staff and let me know how we're doing in terms of diversity. I think we're doing an okay job. We do not have specific goals. We don't have benchmarks. We don't say we need X percent of people. This is a big problem. So I've been in journalism since 1990. And this year we hired 2 Black men. And so now I've worked directly with a total of 5 Black men in 30 years. So think about that for a while. Yeah. If you parachute in, we look great, but my total experience hasn't been so great. But no, the instructions were to hire the best people we could.
Any other ideas on solutions to address diversity in newsrooms? Billy?
Yes, I think that news organizations have to actively create mentorship programs, paid internships, so forth. And I'll tell you what, at least in our area of the country, it seems like the minority students who are looking to become journalists can be found not at the four-year colleges, but at the community college level. And I think we need to do a better job of looking for them and nurturing them at that level. I think that's a very important thing to do. And also, I think that many news organizations don't do a good job of retention. Quite often, you get a journalist of color, and don't work any further to retain them, to keep them, to nurture them, to allow them to aspire and to dream. I don't think it's necessary that a person of color should be sent out to cover their community all the time, although I think that's important. But I think a journalist of color should be able to request us or come up with story ideas that have nothing to do with their ethnicity as well. A journalist is a journalist. A person of color should be better taken care of. I feel very good that my own newspaper does a good job of that, although I do wish that our numbers were higher, of course. But I think those are some of the things that we can do.
Right.
I'm going to quickly just jump in and say that many of my news director colleagues at RTDNA, they attend minority journalism conferences, and they're serious because they go there looking to hire minorities. It has to be intentional. No one's going to accidentally have this ideal candidate, because you may not know that person. If you already knew the person, they'd hire. So news organizations need to be intentional and say, I'm going to go to this conference, I'm going to meet some people and hire the very best person I can find.
That's a lot of
Patty.
good practical advice. Got to find the pipeline, which is often the community college instead of the regular college, and need to work on retention. I listened to a really good podcast this morning with Dean Baquet of the New York Times, and he talked about the New York Times having a pretty good record on diversity, but not so much on inclusion, meaning we hire persons of color and bring them into the newsroom, but we're not doing enough to listen to their voices and include them in the decision-making and understand their point of view on news gathering. Fred, you were about to say something.
Yeah, I was about to say that given the economic conditions now in the newspaper business in particular, it's very hard to expand the staff to give it more diversity. And it's hard. Newspapers never really did attract people who were looking to make a good living. Except maybe I shouldn't say that, because when I started in the newspaper business, it was kind of that way. And then there was a period middle of my career where newspaper jobs and other journalism jobs paid pretty well. But now it's quite difficult to find willing candidates to get into the news business. And in terms of diversity, you know, one of the areas that also needs to be focused on, I think, is political diversity. You find very few conservatives in newsrooms. I think it's because of the nature of the classic definition of a liberal is someone with an open mind, and maybe someone who wants to improve society. And that is the sort of person who goes into journalism. I tell my students at the University of Denver, which is a school that costs a lot of money to go to, that they should, in their work as journalists, talk to people who are not like them. Talk to people who make them uncomfortable so that they get a fuller view of what's going on in society.
There's a question in the chat box from Laura Bliss, who essentially is asking whether you might engender more trust with your audience if you allowed them to review the content of a story, either the text or the full story, before it releases. So generally, journalists say no to that, but would that engender more trust if there is a source, a person of color who's a source who has felt burned in the past? I'm going to go to Lynn on that first. What do you think, this idea of pre-publication review is what we typically have called it.
Hey, I don't know if you can hear me. I have construction going on. So
Maybe you give me the sign when that stops, okay? Fred, what do you think?
I think I just saw a clarification from Laura that she didn't mean all stories.
No, yeah.
I think it is arrogant on the part of a journalist to say, no, you can't look at what I am proposing to write. I think journalists should say they want their stories to be as accurate as possible. And if there are any questions they have, there was an education reporter at the Washington Post, I believe his name is Jay Matthews, who used to let his sources review everything before it was printed. Because he said he was more interested in accuracy than in being this kind of monkish, independent person who didn't, just said, you'll see it when everybody else sees it. It is important too, though, to make it clear that if a person is going to look at what you propose to publish, that it is to check it for accuracy only. If there is anything wrong, you should correct it, but make it very clear that the person is not entitled to edit it for tone or construction or anything else other than accuracy.
Very
And-
good. Yeah, go
sorry,
ahead, Lynn.
Yes, sorry about that. So I think I would add to what Fred said. I think the one thing is I know obviously sometimes speed of deadlines doesn't allow for this, but if when you were talking to the individual and you're looking at the quote and you're kind of putting the story together and you're like, I want to make sure I'm getting this right within the context, you can always follow up. That is allowed and that should be encouraged by journalists, by editors. If you feel that maybe you're not encompassing what was said or you're unsure, follow up with that person, have that second conversation, and kind of ask for that follow-up information. And I think that helps versus, I agree with Fred, for accuracy purposes, I think that is appropriate. For other purposes of kind of looking at the tone of the article, that's not something I would recommend.
We are nearly out of time, so let's go with each person having a final comment. Going forward, how can journalists covering the current protest story remain or behave ethically? Kind of a tip, best practices. You would like to see journalists in the field continue to do X or start to do X? Who will start us off with our last round here?
Just say I encourage journalists in the field to have conversations with the people back in the newsroom, with their bosses, with, if they have a problem with the way that something is being covered or the way that the news station is handling something. I think not being afraid to talk to your bosses and to have those uncomfortable conversations, maybe that can get us on the same track so that we can get to the work that needs to be done. Very
good. Terrence or Billy, would you weigh in next?
Sure. I think it's very important to a conversation like this is a good reminder to be a little more deliberate about how one approaches his or her work out in the field, to be more thoughtful about what you're doing, and to just go forward from there. Be really, really aware of how you are affecting people, and also how they affect you and how they might influence you. It's a two-way street. So just we're people that are professionals at this. We know what we're doing, but we should not really believe that we know what we're doing, as in we should believe that there's always room for improvement in how we approach things.
Great. Terrence.
So context, I think, is something we can improve upon, because often we forget the context these protests are happening in. So just do as much reporting as you can, be as accurate as possible, but always report on the context with which you find these facts, and we'll all be better.
Very good.
Yep.
Lynn, what do you think?
Yeah, I think adding to continue to be accurate and not to let the speed of publication or kind of the need to feel that you need to tweet immediately get in the way of that. I think it's always better to be accurate than to be first. And then I really wish we would allow for more feedback from our audience about the stories we're covering. So kind of ask, how did we do? Should there be other people we're talking to? And then also, can we be a space for constructive conversations within our community? That means, can we bring together police and Black people of color, or whoever it might be at the time, to have these conversations and kind of host them in a way that can lead to change and lead to making just the communities that we live in better.
I love that idea. And of course, SPJ chapters around the country would be an ideal host for such conversations, or RTDNA leaders, or NPPA leaders, right, to facilitate those kind of conversations. That would be such a great outcome of this time. Fred, you get the last word.
I'm going to heartily endorse what you and Lynn have said about following up. I think one of the problems we have as journalists is we tend to report the problem and then not report on the people who are trying to solve the problem or trying to do something about it. And that leads people to think we're all about negativity and not about solutions. You don't have to endorse a solution, but you should pay attention to people who are looking for solutions and try to evaluate how well they're doing.
Very good. So as the protests move into a solution phase in communities around the country, hopefully the news media will continue to cover those solutions and potentially help convene conversations that would inspire solutions. I want to thank each of our guests, Brittany, Terrence, Fred, Lynn, and Billy. I want to thank everybody who attended today. Some very good resources put into the chat field. And of course, I want to thank SPJ for hosting today, and encourage you all to read and use our Code of Ethics and check out the latest edition of Fred's book on journalism ethics. So thanks. Have a great rest of your days.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.